They laughed before the first sapling was even tied in place. From the valley, it looked like she was building a cage around her own home. Long, thin trunks, fresh-cut saplings, were driven into the ground in a tight circle around the cabin. Dozens of them. Then more. Then more still. "What is she doing?" someone asked. "Ruining a perfectly good cabin," another replied. The laughter came easily, because nothing about it made sense. Cabins were meant to be open enough to breathe. Walls? Yes, but not barriers like that. Not layers. Not whatever this was. From a distance, the structure looked wrong. Like the cabin had been trapped inside a bundle of sticks. By the end of the week, people had stopped asking what she was doing. They had started calling it what they believed it was. Ridiculous. Up on the edge of the valley, Mara Ellison didn't look down. She tightened another rope, securing a sapling firmly against the outer frame. Her hands were rough from work, fingers stiff from the cold, but her movements stayed precise. Measured. Deliberate. She stepped back and studied the spacing. Not random. Never random. Each sapling was placed with intention. Angled slightly outward at the base, closer together at the top, forming a dense outer shell that surrounded the cabin without touching it directly. A gap remained between the saplings and the cabin walls. That gap mattered. Everything about this build depended on it. Boots crunched through the frost behind her. Mara didn't turn immediately. She already knew who it would be. "Now I've seen everything." Jonas Hale's voice carried the same amused disbelief it always did when he came up here. Mara turned slowly. Jonas stood at the edge of the structure, hands on his hips, staring up at the saplings like he was trying to make sense of something that refused to be understood. Behind him, a few others lingered, already smiling. "You planning to keep animals out?" Jonas asked. "Or trap yourself in?" The men chuckled. Mara wiped her hands on her coat. "It's a windbreak," she said. Jonas raised an eyebrow. "A windbreak." He walked closer, circling the structure, running a hand along one of the saplings. "You've got a perfectly good cabin," he said. "Solid walls. Roof holds. Fire inside. Why wrap it in sticks?" "Because the walls aren't the problem," Mara replied. Jonas smirked. "Then what is?" "The air around it." That earned a pause. Not because he understood, but because it wasn't the answer he expected. Mara gestured to the space between the saplings and the cabin. "Wind hits the outer layer first," she explained. "Breaks. Slows. The air in between stays still. That layer holds warmth." Jonas looked at the gap, then at the saplings, then back at her. "You built yourself a second wall of air," he said, half laughing. Mara nodded once. "Yes." The laughter came louder this time. Because to them, that sounded like nothing. Invisible. Useless. Jonas shook his head. "You always did like making things harder than they need to be." Mara didn't respond. She turned back to her work. Jonas lingered a moment longer. "You know," he added, "there are cabins down in the valley that don't need all this." Mara's hands tightened slightly on the rope. "They don't need it yet," she said. Jonas let out a short laugh. "There it is again." He turned to the others. "She's building for a winter that doesn't exist." They all laughed as they headed back down the slope. Mara didn't watch them go. She kept working. Sapling after sapling. Layer after layer. The structure grew thicker. Denser. Not just a circle, but a barrier. A filter. By the time she finished, the cabin was barely visible from a distance. All anyone could see was the outer shell. A rough, uneven wall of vertical wood surrounding something hidden inside. It looked crude. Primitive. Like something thrown together without thought. That's why they kept laughing. But inside that outer shell, the space between it and the cabin felt different. Still. Quiet. Even on windy days, the air there barely moved. Mara stepped into that space one evening, holding her hands out slightly. The difference was immediate. Outside the saplings, the wind bit. Inside, it softened. Not gone, but weakened. Broken. She nodded to herself. Good. That's what she needed. That night, she lit a small fire inside the cabin. She didn't build it large. Didn't need to. The warmth spread slowly. And for the first time, it didn't seem to vanish as quickly. It lingered. Held. Because the air around the cabin wasn't stealing it anymore. Down in the valley, life continued as always. Cabin stood exposed to the wind. Fires burned hot and fast. Doors rattled in the cold. But no one worried. Winter here had always been manageable. Predictable. Something you endured, not something that tested you. The sapling-wrapped cabin became a story. A joke people repeated. She's living inside a bundle of sticks. Let's see how that helps when the real cold comes. Mara ignored it. She stayed on the ridge. Watching. Waiting. Preparing. The first sign came with the wind. It changed. Not gradually. Not subtly. It sharpened. Instead of rolling through the valley, it struck it. Hard. Direct. Relentless. Mara felt it immediately. Even through the saplings, she could hear the difference. The sound. The pressure. Something about it was wrong. She stepped outside the outer shell, just for a moment. The cold hit her face like a blade. Sharper than it should have been. She stepped back inside the sapling barrier. The difference was immediate again. Still cold. But muted. Controlled. She closed her eyes briefly, then went inside the cabin and sealed the door. Down in the valley, people noticed the change. But they didn't react. Just a cold snap, they said. It'll pass. It didn't. The temperature dropped overnight. Fast. Faster than anything they had seen before. Fires burned earlier. Hotter. But something was wrong. The heat didn't stay. It slipped through walls. Through gaps. Through everything. Mara stood inside her cabin, watching the small fire flicker. The warmth held better than before. Not perfect, but enough. Because outside the walls, there was a second layer. A trapped space. A buffer. The storm came without warning. Wind roared across the valley, tearing through gaps, forcing snow into every weakness. Cabins groaned. Doors rattled violently. Inside, the cold pushed in. Relentless. Men fed fires faster than ever. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Because the problem wasn't the fire. It was the exposure. Up on the ridge, the storm hit Mara's structure. But the saplings took it first. Wind broke against them, splintering its force before it ever reached the cabin. Snow caught in the outer layer, building up, thickening the barrier. Inside that space, the air stayed still, protected. And inside the cabin, the warmth held. Mara placed her hand against the inner wall. It wasn't freezing. It wasn't losing heat the way it should have. It was working, exactly as she intended. She exhaled slowly. Then, a sound. Faint. Carried through the storm. A knock. Mara's eyes opened. It came again. Harder. Closer. She moved quickly, stepping out through the cabin door and into the narrow space between the walls. Then to the outer entrance. She pushed it open. The storm surged forward. And through it, a figure stumbled. Jonas Hale. Snow clung to him. His face pale, his confidence gone. The cold, he choked. It's inside the cabins, fires won't hold. He looked at her, something desperate in his eyes now. Yours, he said. It's the only one standing against it. He took a step forward. Please. Mara didn't hesitate. She pulled the outer gate wider and caught Jonas by the arm before he could fall. Inside, she said. He stumbled into the narrow space between the saplings and the cabin wall. The wind dropped immediately, not gone, but broken, scattered. Jonas blinked, confused by the sudden change. It's quieter, he muttered. Keep moving, Mara said. She guided him through the inner door and sealed it behind them. The cabin closed around them. Tight, controlled, warm enough to feel like relief instead of effort. Jonas sank onto a stool near the stove, hands shaking. For a moment, he said nothing. He just stared at the walls, then at the door, then back at her. The wind, he said slowly. It's not hitting you the same. Mara added a small piece of wood to the fire. It can't, she replied. It loses strength before it gets here. Jonas looked toward the door, as if he could still see the saplings outside. That layer, he said. It's doing something. It's stopping movement, Mara said. Cold air moves. Break the movement, and you slow the loss. Jonas let out a breath, the tension in him shifting into something heavier. They won't last, he said. Not like this. Mara met his eyes. How bad? Jonas swallowed. Worse than anything we've seen. Fires are burning through wood, but the heat disappears. Walls are freezing from the inside. Mara nodded once. She had expected that. How many, she asked. All of them. The answer came quicker this time. Because there was no pride left to protect. Mara grabbed her coat. Jonas frowned. You can't bring everyone here. No, she said. But I can give them what this place has. She stepped out into the narrow airspace, then opened the outer gate again. The storm slammed into the saplings, but not cleanly. It fractured, split, tangled through the vertical wood. Mara pushed through it. Jonas followed. The descent to the valley was brutal. The wind fought them. Snow blinded them. The cold tried to drag the strength from their limbs. They reached the first cabin. Mara forced the door open. Inside, the cold felt worse. Trapped, biting, suffocating. A family huddled near a weak fire, barely moving. Up, Mara said, firm and steady. You're coming with me. No one argued. They couldn't. Trip by trip, they moved through the valley. Each house, each family. Some could walk. Some had to be carried. Mara didn't rush blindly. She kept it controlled. Small groups. Steady movement. When they reached her cabin, she didn't take them inside immediately. Stay here, she said, guiding them into the space between the saplings and the cabin. At first, they looked confused. Then they felt it. The difference. The wind wasn't cutting anymore. The air wasn't still warm, but it wasn't attacking them either. Stand close, Mara instructed. Keep together. Jonas watched their expressions change. They're stabilizing, he said quietly. Mara nodded. The outer layer is enough to stop the worst of it. She opened the inner door. Rotate in groups. Warm up inside, then come back out here. Share the space. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable. But it worked. More people came. The space filled. Then shifted. Then filled again. The saplings caught snow, thickening the barrier. The trapped air layer grew more insulated with each passing hour. Inside, the fire stayed low. It didn't need to fight. It only needed to support. Jonas stood near the inner door, watching everything unfold. Watching people who had been on the edge begin to steady. Watching the system hold. You didn't just build a cabin, he said. Mara adjusted the door latch. I built a buffer, she replied. By the time they made their final trip, the valley had gone silent. No more movement. No more light. Just snow-covered shapes where homes had stood. Mara paused at the edge of the ridge for a moment, scanning through the storm. Then she turned back. The climb felt heavier now. But she didn't stop. When she reached the cabin, the outer space was full. People stood close together, wrapped in blankets, leaning against the saplings, their breathing steady. Alive. She stepped through them, into the cabin, then closed the inner door. The storm faded again. Hours passed. The wind weakened. The pressure lifted. No one froze. The rotation held. The system worked. By morning, the storm was gone. Mara opened the outer gate. Cold air slipped in, but it was nothing like before. Just winter. Manageable. People stepped out slowly, one by one. The valley below was buried. Roofs sagged under heavy snow. Doors sealed shut. Chimneys silent. Cabins that had once seemed strong now looked thin. Exposed. Temporary. No one spoke at first. They just looked. Then, gradually, their eyes turned back to Mara's cabin. Not at the cabin itself, but at the saplings, the layer they had laughed at. Days later, when the snow began to melt, they came back. With tools. With rope. With questions. How far from the wall? One asked. How tight should the spacing be? Another said. Mara showed them. The distance. The angle. The purpose. Don't press it against the cabin, she explained. You need the space. That's what holds the air. They listened. Because this time, they understood. By the end of winter, the valley changed. Cabins stood with new outer frames, rows of saplings, windbreaks, layered barriers that turned exposure into protection. And on the ridge, Mara's cabin stood as it always had. Simple. Quiet. Surrounded. No longer ridiculous. Now repeated. Because in that valley, they learned something they hadn't before. The cold isn't just something you fight. It's something you manage. And sometimes, the smartest protection is the layer no one can see until it saves them.